The security camera footage showed everything I needed to see and everything I never wanted to know. My wife Margaret stood in our driveway at 2:47 a.m., pressed against Van Davis like they were teenagers sneaking around behind the school gymnasium. Her hands were in his hair, his were places they had no business being, and my 17 years of marriage crumbled into digital pixels on a 9-inch screen. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I'm Edwin Granger, 43 years old, maintenance chief at the Millbrook Water Treatment Plant, and apparently the last person in town to know my wife was screwing her business partner. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd installed those cameras 6 months ago to protect our home from break-ins, not to document my own life falling apart in high-definition clarity. "Dad, you okay up there?" Tommy's voice drifted up from the basement, where he was supposedly doing homework. My 16-year-old son had inherited my suspicious nature and his mother's ability to sense trouble brewing from 3 rooms away. "Fine, kiddo. Just checking something," I called back, rewinding the footage to watch my humiliation in slow motion. Margaret's BMW had pulled in quietly, headlights off, followed 30 seconds later by Van's ridiculous red Corvette. They'd sat in their cars for almost 10 minutes, probably texting each other like horny teenagers, before the main event began. Van Davis. I should have seen this coming the moment Margaret brought him into her consulting firm 8 months ago. Former military contractor, she'd said. Brilliant strategic mind, exactly what her company needed to land those big government contracts. What she'd failed to mention was that he looked like he'd stepped off the cover of some middle-aged action hero magazine, complete with the kind of confident smirk that made decent husbands want to punch walls. I'd met him twice. Once at Margaret's company Christmas party, where he'd gripped my hand just a little too hard and held eye contact just a little too long, like he was sizing me up for a coffin. The second time was 3 weeks ago, when he'd stopped by the house to pick up some files. Margaret had been upstairs getting ready, and Van had made himself comfortable in my kitchen, commenting on our cozy little setup with the kind of condescending tone usually reserved for petting zoos and retirement homes. "Nice place you've got here, Ed," he'd said, running his fingers along my workbench like he was appraising it for auction. "Very practical." Practical. The way he'd said it made it sound like a disease. Now, watching him grope my wife in my own driveway, I understood exactly what he'd been appraising that day. Not my house, my life. And apparently, he'd decided he wanted it. The footage showed them separating after about 5 minutes of what my grandfather would have called heavy petting. They stood close together, talking intently. Margaret kept glancing toward the house, and Van kept checking his phone. Planning their next move, probably. Figuring out how to make this whole messy situation work in their favor. I fast-forwarded through the next hour. At 3:52 a.m., Margaret finally came inside. I'd pretended to be asleep, listening to her creep up the stairs and slip into bed beside me. She'd smelled like his cologne, something expensive and aggressive that probably cost more than I made in a week. When she'd whispered, "I love you," into the darkness, I'd nearly laughed out loud. Van's Corvette had stayed in the driveway until 4:15 a.m. The camera showed him making several phone calls, smoking 2 cigarettes, and at one point, getting out to examine our mailbox like he was already planning to change the name on it. I saved the footage to 3 different flash drives and uploaded it to a cloud storage account Margaret didn't know about. Then I sat back in my desk chair and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. The smart move would be to confront her immediately, lay the evidence on the table, demand explanations, start talking about lawyers and custody arrangements and who gets the good dishes, the mature adult approach. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way Van had looked at my house that day, like he was already measuring it for new furniture. Maybe it was the casual cruelty in Margaret's voice when she'd started complaining about our boring little life. 6 months ago. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that I'd spent 17 years trying to be the good guy. And where had it gotten me? Watching my wife make out with another man in my own driveway, that's where. I closed the laptop and headed downstairs to check on Tommy. He was sprawled across the couch in our finished basement, textbooks scattered around him like he'd been hit by an academic tornado. The kid had gotten Margaret's brains and my stubborn streak, a combination that served him well in school and made him impossible to lie to. "Mom's working late again?" he asked, without looking up from his calculus homework. "Something like that. She's been working late a lot recently." I studied my son's face, looking for signs that he knew more than he was letting on. But Tommy was focused on his math, pencil scratching across paper as he worked through some equation that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all I understood it. "Yeah, well, that's what happens when you're trying to build a business," I said. "Takes time." "Guess so." Tommy glanced up at me. "You look tired, Dad. You should get some sleep." Smart kid. Too smart for his own good sometimes. I headed back upstairs and found Margaret's laptop still open on the kitchen counter. She'd been careless lately, leaving it unlocked, password-protected files sitting open like invitations. I'd noticed, but hadn't acted on it. Some combination of respect for her privacy and fear of what I might find. Tonight, fear lost. Her email was a goldmine of incrimination. Messages from Van that started professional 3 months ago and turned increasingly personal. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Ed doesn't deserve you. Soon we won't have to hide anymore." But it was the folder labeled Transition Plans that made my blood run cold. Inside were documents I recognized from my own workplace. Schematics of the water treatment plant, employee schedules, security protocols, information that Margaret shouldn't have had access to, information that could only have come from someone with administrative clearance, someone like me. There were also financial records showing large cash deposits into an account I'd never seen before, and what looked like a preliminary custody agreement giving Margaret full parental rights to Tommy. At the bottom of the folder was a single document that made everything clear. A detailed plan to frame me for sabotaging the city's water supply. They weren't just planning to steal my wife and destroy my marriage. They were planning to destroy my life completely, send me to prison, and take everything I'd worked for. Van would get Margaret, the house, and a ready-made family, while I rotted in a federal penitentiary for domestic terrorism. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time, letting the full scope of their betrayal sink in. This wasn't just an affair. It was a hostile takeover. Margaret and Van had looked at my life the same way corporate raiders look at struggling businesses, something to be stripped down, sold off, and rebuilt in their own image. The old Edwin would have called the police, hired a lawyer, tried to fight this thing through proper channels. The old Edwin believed in justice and fairness and the basic decency of human beings. But the old Edwin had never been betrayed by the person he trusted most in the world. I copied every file in the folder onto my flash drives, then cleared the browser history and closed the laptop. Upstairs, Margaret was sleeping peacefully, probably dreaming about her new life with Van. She looked innocent in the moonlight streaming through our bedroom window. The same woman I'd fallen in love with 20 years ago, before ambition and greed had turned her into someone I didn't recognize. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my workshop in the basement, surrounded by the tools and projects that had always been my escape from the world's complications. But tonight, instead of fixing broken appliances or building furniture, I was planning something else entirely. If Margaret and Van wanted to play games with my life, I'd teach them the rules. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other day in my carefully constructed hell. I was making coffee in my kitchen, watching Margaret butter her toast with the same methodical precision she brought to destroying marriages, when my work phone rang. "Ed, We need you down here immediately." Jim Kowalski's voice carried the kind of panic that made experienced maintenance chiefs reach for their antacids. Jim was the plant supervisor, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything from equipment failures to worker accidents, and he never panicked. "What's the situation?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. "Someone sabotaged the main filtration system, contaminated half the city's water supply. The state environmental people are on their way, and they're asking specifically for you." My blood turned to ice water. I looked at Margaret, who was suddenly paying very close attention to our conversation, despite pretending to read her phone. Her acting skills had apparently improved, along with her adultery techniques. "I'll be right there," I said, ending the call. "Problems at work?" Margaret asked, with just the right amount of concerned wife inflection. "Nothing I can't handle." But we both knew that wasn't true. The drive to the plant gave me 12 minutes to think, which was 11 minutes too many. The timing was perfect, too perfect. Margaret and Van had spent weeks gathering information about plant operations, security schedules, and my access codes. Now, just as I'd discovered their affair and their plans, suddenly there was a major sabotage incident that would require investigation. Investigation that would lead directly to me. The plant was swarming with official vehicles when I arrived. State Environmental Protection Agency, FBI, local police, and enough hazmat suits to outfit a small army. Jim met me at the gate, his face gray with stress and something that might have been sympathy. "Ed, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Anyone asking questions about plant operations? Any security breaches?" "Nothing out of the ordinary," I said, which was technically true. Margaret stealing classified information from my home office wasn't exactly ordinary, but it wasn't something I could prove without admitting I'd been spying on my own wife. "The thing is," Jim continued, walking me toward the main building, "whoever did this knew exactly which systems to target. They understood our filtration process, our backup protocols, even our emergency response procedures. This wasn't some random vandalism. This was someone with inside knowledge." We passed through 3 security checkpoints before reaching the control room, where a team of federal investigators was examining computer terminals and taking photographs of everything that wasn't nailed down. A woman in an expensive suit looked up as we entered. "Mr. Granger, I'm Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. We need to ask you some questions about your access to these systems." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in professional interrogation. Agent Chen was good, really good. She asked about my work schedule, my access codes, my relationships with other employees, and my recent activities outside of work. She was particularly interested in my home computer setup and whether I'd ever taken work files home. "It's standard practice," I explained. "Sometimes I need to review technical manuals or system schematics when I'm troubleshooting problems." "And these files, they would contain sensitive information about plant operations?" "Some of them, yes." "Who else in your household would have access to these files?" There it was, the question I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. "My wife occasionally uses my home office for her own work. My son might have access, but he's not interested in water treatment systems." Agent Chen made notes in a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "We'll need to examine your home computers and any work-related materials you have there." "Of course, whatever you need." But I knew what they'd find. Margaret and Van had been too smart to leave obvious evidence of their theft, but they'd been careful to make sure my fingerprints were all over everything. My access codes, my security clearance, my work files, all of it would point directly to me as the inside man who'd provided information to saboteurs. The search warrant arrived at my house at 3:30 p.m., just as Tommy was getting home from school. He stood in our driveway watching federal agents carry computers and file boxes out of our house like he was witnessing the end of the world. In a way, he was. Margaret arrived 20 minutes later, perfectly timed to provide maximum dramatic impact. She rushed to Tommy's side, wrapping him in a protective hug while staring at me with what looked like genuine shock and betrayal. "Edwin, what's happening? What have you done?" Her performance was flawless. The concerned wife, the protective mother, the woman who'd just discovered her husband might be a domestic terrorist. If I hadn't seen the evidence of her betrayal with my own eyes, I might have believed it myself. "There's been a problem at the plant," I said carefully, aware that everything I said was being recorded and would probably be used against me later. "They're investigating everyone with access to sensitive systems." "But why are they searching our house? Why are they taking our computers?" Agent Chen approached us, her expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Granger, we have evidence that classified information about the water treatment facility was accessed from computers in this house. We need to determine how that information might have been compromised." Margaret's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, and finally, a dawning horror that belonged in a community theater production. You think my husband sabotaged the water plant?" "We're investigating all possibilities." Tommy looked back and forth between his parents, trying to process what was happening. "Dad, you didn't do anything wrong, right? This is just some kind of mistake?" I wanted to tell him the truth, that his mother was a lying, cheating sociopath who'd orchestrated this entire situation to destroy our family. But with federal agents recording every word and my son's world already crumbling around him, I chose a different approach. "Sometimes good people get caught up in bad situations, kiddo. But everything's going to work out." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie fathers tell their children when the truth would hurt too much. The agents finished their search by 6 p.m., taking with them every computer, tablet, and storage device in the house. They also took my work files, technical manuals, and anything else that might contain sensitive information. By the time they left, our house felt like it had been stripped bare. Margaret made dinner while I helped Tommy with his homework, both of us pretending this was just another normal evening in the Granger household. But the pretense was wearing thin. Tommy kept glancing at the empty spaces where our computers used to be, and Margaret kept checking her phone with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was coordinating with someone, probably Van, getting updates on how perfectly their plan was working. After Tommy went to bed, Margaret and I sat in our living room avoiding eye contact and conversation. Finally, she broke the silence. "Edwin, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did you take those files? Did you give information to someone who could have used it to hurt people?" I studied her face, looking for any sign of the woman I'd married, but all I saw was a stranger wearing my wife's features, playing a role in a drama she'd written herself. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think you've been angry lately. Angry about my work, angry about the time I spend away from home, angry about the success I've had with the consulting business. I think maybe you wanted to hurt me, and you didn't think about who else might get hurt in the process." It was a beautiful piece of manipulation, turning my legitimate concerns about her behavior into evidence of my guilt. She was already building the narrative that would justify everything that came next. "And what happens if the FBI decides I'm guilty?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were wet with tears that might have been real. "Then I'll have to protect Tommy. I'll have to make sure he's safe, even if that means we can't be a family anymore." There it was. The custody play, delivered with perfect timing and just the right amount of reluctant maternal sacrifice. She was giving me one last chance to confess, to make this easy for everyone involved. All I had to do was admit to crimes I didn't commit, and she'd make sure Tommy was taken care of while I spent the next 20 years in federal prison. "I understand," I said. And I did. I understood that Margaret and Van had planned this perfectly, that they'd anticipated every move and prepared for every contingency. They'd studied me like a lab specimen, identified my weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical precision. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was the same man I'd been 6 months ago, the trusting husband, the devoted father, the guy who believed in playing by the rules even when the rules were rigged against him. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The handcuffs clicked shut at 7:23 a.m. on a Thursday morning. That would have been beautiful if I hadn't been watching it through the back window of a federal transport vehicle. Agent Chen had arrived with a full tactical team, as if I were some kind of dangerous fugitive instead of a water plant maintenance chief who'd never gotten so much as a speeding ticket. Edwin Granger, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism, sabotage of critical infrastructure, and endangering public safety. The words sounded surreal, like dialogue from a bad television show. But the handcuffs were real enough, and so was the look of manufactured shock on Margaret's face as she watched her husband being dragged away. Tommy had already left for school, which was probably for the best. Some things a 16-year-old shouldn't have to see, even if his mother had orchestrated the whole performance. The ride to the federal building gave me time to think about how perfectly they'd played this. The sabotage had been sophisticated enough to require inside knowledge, but sloppy enough to leave clear evidence pointing to me. My work files, my access codes, my fingerprints on everything. It was a frame job so elegant it was almost artistic. The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect from a federal facility. Clean, sterile, and designed to make you feel like a very small cog in a very large machine. I sat on the metal bench and reviewed everything I knew about Margaret and Van's plan, looking for weaknesses, inconsistencies, anything I could use to prove my innocence. The problem was, they'd been thorough. Every piece of evidence supported their narrative. The bitter husband, angry about his wife's success, taking revenge by sabotaging the city's infrastructure. It was believable because it contained just enough truth to be convincing. I was angry about Margaret's success, not because she was successful, but because of what success had turned her into. I had been distant lately, not because I was planning terrorism, but because I was trying to figure out why my wife had become a stranger. And I did have access to all the information used in the sabotage, because it was my job to know those systems inside and out. My lawyer arrived at 2 p.m. David Brennan was a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, and who probably had about 15 minutes to spend on my case before moving on to the next poor bastard caught in the federal justice system. Mr. Granger, I'm going to be straight with you. The evidence against you is substantial. They have your access codes, your work files, and computer records showing that classified information was accessed from your home network. They also have statements from co-workers indicating you'd been acting strangely lately. What kind of statements? Brennan consulted his notes. Complaints about your attitude, concerns about your marriage, comments about feeling unappreciated and overlooked. The prosecution is building a profile of a man under stress who made increasingly poor decisions. I almost laughed. Margaret had been busy, apparently, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state with people who'd known me for years. A comment here, a concerned observation there, all designed to create the impression that Edwin Granger was a man on the edge. What about my wife? Have they interviewed her? Extensively. She's been very cooperative, very concerned about your welfare. She mentioned that you'd been working late, bringing classified materials home, and becoming increasingly secretive about your activities. Of course she had. Margaret was probably the prosecution's star witness, the loyal wife trying to help authorities understand how her husband had gone so wrong. Mr. Brennan, I need you to investigate my wife's business partner, Van Davis. I believe he and my wife are having an affair, and I think they're working together to frame me. Brennan looked up from his notes with the expression of a man who'd heard every conspiracy theory known to criminal defendants. Do you have evidence of this affair? Security camera footage, emails, financial records. Where are these materials now? I thought about the flash drives hidden in my workshop, the cloud storage account Margaret didn't know about, the careful documentation I'd been building for weeks. The FBI probably seized them when they searched my house. Then we'll request access to those materials during discovery. But Mr. Granger, I need you to understand something. Even if your wife is having an affair, that doesn't prove you're innocent of these charges. In fact, it might provide additional motive for your actions. He was right, of course. A cheating wife would only strengthen the prosecution's case that I was a man driven to desperate measures by personal betrayal. Margaret and Van had thought of everything. The arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday. Until then, I'd be held without bail. Domestic terrorism charges didn't typically come with weekend passes. I spent the next 4 days in federal custody, eating terrible food and thinking about how completely I'd been outmaneuvered. But I also spent time thinking about Van Davis, and the more I thought about him, the more convinced I became that he was the weak link in their plan. Margaret was smart, careful, and methodical. Van was arrogant, impulsive, and used to getting his way through intimidation rather than intelligence. Men like Van Davis always made mistakes eventually. I just had to survive long enough to catch him making one. The arraignment was a formality. I pled not guilty to all charges, bail was denied, and I was remanded to federal custody pending trial. The whole process took less than 10 minutes, but the courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle of a domestic terrorism case in our quiet little city. Margaret sat in the front row, dressed in conservative black, like she was already attending my funeral. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue during the proceedings, playing the role of the devastated wife to perfection. Van wasn't there, too smart to be seen publicly supporting the wife of the man he'd helped frame. After the arraignment, I was transferred to the county jail to await trial. The federal facility had been sterile and impersonal. The county jail was something else entirely. Overcrowded, understaffed, and filled with men who had nothing left to lose, it was exactly the kind of place where a middle-aged water plant worker could disappear without anyone asking too many questions. My cellmate was a career criminal named Bobby Torino, who'd been arrested for running a prescription drug ring. Bobby was in his 50s, built like a fire hydrant, and covered in tattoos that told the story of 30 years in and out of the system. "What are you in for?" he asked on my first night, sizing me up with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to identify threats and opportunities quickly. "Domestic terrorism." Bobby whistled low. "No shit? You blow something up?" "Water treatment plant, allegedly." "Allegedly." Bobby grinned, showing teeth that had seen better decades. "I like that. Very classy. You actually do it?" "What do you think?" "I think you don't look like the type. Too clean, too polite. This is your first time inside, right?" I nodded. "Thought so. You got that deer in the headlights thing going on, so if you didn't blow up the water plant, who did?" Over the next few days, I found myself telling Bobby the whole story. It felt good to talk to someone who didn't assume I was guilty, someone who understood how the system could be manipulated by people with money and connections. Bobby listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he was paying attention. "Your wife sounds like a real piece of work," he said, after I'd finished explaining about Margaret and Van's plan. "Reminds me of my second ex-wife. That bitch tried to have me killed for the insurance money." "What happened?" "I had her boyfriend killed instead." Bobby saw my expression and laughed. "Kidding. Mostly. But I did make sure everyone knew what kind of woman she really was. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people see the truth. The truth doesn't seem to matter much when you're sitting in jail. That's because you're playing their game by their rules. You want to win, you got to change the game." Bobby had connections throughout the jail. Guards who owed him favors, inmates who provided information, lawyers who weren't too particular about ethics. Within a week, he'd arranged for me to make phone calls that wouldn't be recorded and to receive visitors who weren't on my official list. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. "Because I like you, and because your story pisses me off. I hate people who think they're smarter than everyone else. Your wife and her boyfriend, they think they got it all figured out. But everybody makes mistakes, especially arrogant people. And what if they don't make mistakes? Bobby's grin turned predatory. Then we help them make some. The plan started taking shape over the following weeks. It was risky, probably illegal, and definitely the kind of thing that would destroy what was left of my reputation if it went wrong. But sitting in a jail cell, facing 20 years in federal prison for crimes I didn't commit, I found myself caring less about reputation and more about survival. Margaret visited once, 2 weeks after my arrest. She sat across from me in the visitor's room, perfectly dressed and professionally sympathetic, playing her role for the guards and other visitors. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "About as well as you'd expect. Tommy asks about you every day. I don't know what to tell him." "Tell him his father isn't a terrorist." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Real ones, I thought, though with her it was hard to tell. "Edwin, if you did this thing, if you were involved somehow, you need to tell your lawyer. Maybe they can work out some kind of deal. And if I didn't do it, then I'll stand by you. We'll fight this together, as a family." It was a beautiful lie, delivered with perfect sincerity. If I hadn't known about her affair, hadn't seen the evidence of her betrayal, I might have believed her. Hell, I might have confessed just to spare her the pain of a long trial. But I did know, and I wasn't the same man who'd trusted her blindly for 17 years. "I appreciate that," I said. "It means everything to know you're on my side." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Always, Edwin. No matter what happens, I love you." After she left, I sat in my cell thinking about the woman I'd married and the stranger she'd become. Somewhere along the way, Margaret had decided that her happiness mattered more than our marriage, more than our family, more than the basic human decency that keeps civilization from collapsing into chaos. She'd made her choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. The medical emergency was Bobby's idea, but the execution was all mine. 3 months in county jail had taught me things about human nature that 17 years of marriage never had. Specifically, how easy it was to manipulate people when you understood their weaknesses and motivations. Dr. Patricia Vance was the jail's medical officer, a woman in her early 60s who'd taken the job because she genuinely wanted to help people that society had given up on. She was competent, caring, and exactly the kind of person who would take a prisoner's medical complaints seriously, especially when those complaints suggested a life-threatening condition. The symptoms started on a Tuesday morning. Chest pains, difficulty breathing, numbness in my left arm, classic signs of cardiac distress that couldn't be ignored or dismissed as malingering. I'd done my research, courtesy of Bobby's connections to inmates who'd faked their way out of jail for medical treatment. "Mr. Granger, I need you to describe exactly what you're feeling," Dr. Vance said, as she examined me in the jail's medical unit. "It started about an hour ago. Sharp pain in my chest, like someone squeezing my heart. My left arm feels like it's asleep, and I can't seem to catch my breath." She checked my pulse, blood pressure, and heart rhythm with an EKG machine that belonged in a museum. The readings were concerning enough to warrant immediate transport to the hospital, exactly what Bobby had predicted. "I'm recommending immediate transfer to Millbrook General for cardiac evaluation," she told the guard. "This could be a heart attack, and we don't have the facilities to treat that here." The ambulance ride gave me my first taste of freedom in 3 months, even if it was the view through small windows with wire mesh. The EMTs were professional and focused, monitoring my vital signs and asking questions about my medical history. I played the role of the frightened patient perfectly, answering their questions while privately marveling at how easy it was to fool people when you told them what they expected to hear. Millbrook General Hospital was a sprawling complex that had grown organically over decades, adding wings and departments without much concern for logical layout or security. It was exactly the kind of place where a patient could get lost in the system, especially during the chaos of a shift change. The emergency room was busy that afternoon. Car accident victims, drug overdoses, and the usual collection of people whose lives had taken sudden turns for the worse. I was wheeled into a treatment bay and connected to monitoring equipment while nurses bustled around preparing for tests that would prove I wasn't actually having a heart attack. The guard assigned to watch me was a young guy named Peterson, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He sat in a chair next to my bed, checking his phone and trying to stay awake during what was obviously the most boring assignment in law enforcement. "How long do these tests usually take?" he asked the nurse. "Could be several hours. We need to run blood work, do an EKG, maybe a stress test if the doctor thinks it's necessary." Peterson sighed and settled in for a long wait. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was accepting the coffee that Bobby's contact, a hospital orderly named Miguel, brought him around 4 p.m. The coffee was perfectly normal except for the mild sedative that Miguel had added, just enough to make Peterson drowsy without knocking him unconscious. By 5 p.m., Peterson was struggling to keep his eyes open. By 5:15, he was asleep in his chair, snoring softly while the monitors beeped reassuringly around my bed. Miguel appeared at my bedside like a guardian angel in scrubs. "You ready to go?" I nodded, carefully removing the monitoring leads from my chest. The machines immediately started alarming, but Miguel had already disabled the central monitoring station's connection to my room. To anyone watching the main desk, it would look like a simple equipment malfunction. Miguel handed me a set of scrubs and a hospital ID badge. "Maintenance staff, you're here to fix a broken air conditioning unit on the 3rd floor. Elevators at the end of the hall. Service exit is on the ground floor near the loading dock. What about Peterson? He'll sleep for another hour, maybe 2. By the time he wakes up, you'll be long gone." The walk through the hospital was the longest 5 minutes of my life. Every nurse, every doctor, every security guard I passed was a potential threat, someone who might recognize me from the news coverage or notice that I didn't belong. But the ID badge and confident stride worked perfectly. I was just another maintenance worker, invisible to people who had more important things to worry about. The service exit opened onto a loading dock where Bobby's other contact, his nephew Danny, was waiting with a beat-up Honda Civic that had seen better decades. "You, Edwin?" Danny was maybe 25, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be selling drugs than helping federal fugitives escape from hospitals. "That's me." "Uncle Bobby says to tell you the clock is ticking. They'll figure out you're gone pretty quick, and then this whole city's going to be crawling with cops." Danny drove like his life depended on it, taking back roads and side streets to avoid the main thoroughfares where police might be setting up roadblocks. We ended up at a storage facility on the outskirts of town, where Bobby had arranged for me to lay low until the initial search died down. "Unit 47, Danny said, handing me a key. "There's food, water, and some other stuff Uncle Bobby thought you might need. He says to stay put for at least 24 hours before making any moves." The storage unit was small, windowless, and filled with the kind of supplies that suggested Bobby had used it for similar purposes before. Canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, and a duffel bag containing clothes in my size, a fake ID, and $3,000 in cash. There was also a cell phone with a note. "Untraceable. Use it wisely." B. I spent the next 18 hours in that storage unit, listening to news reports about my escape and thinking about what came next. The media was having a field day with the story. Domestic terrorist escapes from hospital, manhunt underway, residents advised to stay indoors. My photograph was on every local news station, usually accompanied by speculation about where I might be hiding and whether I posed a danger to the public. Margaret gave an interview to Channel 7 News, standing in front of our house with tears in her eyes and fear in her voice. "I just want Edwin to turn himself in before someone gets hurt. This isn't the man I married. I don't know what's happened to him, but I'm praying he'll come to his senses and surrender to authorities." It was a masterful performance, hitting all the right notes of concern, fear, and lingering loyalty. She was building her public image as the loyal wife of a man who'd lost his mind, positioning herself as a victim rather than a conspirator. Van Davis was nowhere to be seen in the news coverage, which was smart. Let Margaret handle the public relations while he stayed in the background, pulling strings and making sure their plans stayed on track. But staying in the background also meant Van felt safe, and safe people made mistakes. On my second night of freedom, I used Bobby's untraceable phone to call a number I'd memorized during my weeks in jail. It belonged to a private investigator named Frank Russo, another of Bobby's contacts, who specialized in the kind of work that regular PIs wouldn't touch. "You the guy Bobby told me about?" "That's me. He said you might need some information gathered, the kind of information that might not be easy to get through normal channels." "I need everything you can find on Van Davis. Financial records, phone records, travel history, personal associations, especially anything that connects him to the water plant sabotage." "That's going to cost extra. Guy like that, he's going to have lawyers and security people protecting his information." "How much?" $5,000 plus expenses. It was most of the money Bobby had left me, but information was the only weapon I had left. "Deal. How long?" "Give me a week, maybe less if I get lucky." While Frank worked his magic, I started my own investigation. The storage facility was perfect for planning. Isolated, secure, and equipped with everything I needed to wage war against people who thought they'd already won. I started with Margaret's daily routine, watching from a distance as she went to work, picked up groceries, and played the role of the concerned wife whose husband had gone off the deep end. She was careful, professional, and completely convinced that she was untouchable. Van was more interesting. He'd moved into a luxury apartment downtown, driving his red Corvette like he owned the world, and spending money like it was going out of style. He frequented expensive restaurants, high-end bars, and the kind of private clubs where rich people went to feel superior to everyone else. But he also made mistakes. He parked in the same spots, ate at the same restaurants, and followed patterns that made him predictable. Most importantly, he was arrogant enough to believe that a dead man walking like me could never pose a real threat to someone like him. Frank called on Friday night with preliminary results. "Your boy Van Davis is interesting. Clean record, good credit, successful business. But he's got some unusual financial activity over the past 6 months. Large cash deposits, offshore accounts, payments to people who don't officially exist." "What kind of people?" "The kind who specialize in making problems disappear. Computer hackers, document forgers, and at least one guy who used to work for the same government contractor that employed Van before he went private." "Someone who might know how to sabotage a water treatment plant?" "Someone who might know exactly how to sabotage a water treatment plant and make it look like an inside job." The pieces were falling into place. Van hadn't just seduced my wife and stolen my life. He'd hired professionals to frame me for domestic terrorism. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business transaction. "Keep digging," I told Frank. "I need names, dates, and proof that will hold up in court." "You planning to turn this over to the authorities?" I thought about Agent Chen, about my public defender who'd already written me off as guilty, about a justice system that had been manipulated by people with money and connections. Something like that. By the end of my first week of freedom, I had a plan. It was dangerous, probably illegal, and almost certainly the kind of thing that would get me killed if it went wrong. But sitting in that storage unit, surrounded by evidence of my wife's betrayal and the systematic destruction of my life, I realized I'd already lost everything that mattered. Everything except the chance for revenge. Frank's final report arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like Christmas and Judgment Day rolled into one devastating package. Van Davis wasn't just guilty of framing me. He was guilty of enough federal crimes to put him away for the rest of his life if I could prove it. The evidence was beautiful in its complexity. Van had hired Marcus Webb, a former NSA contractor, to infiltrate the water treatment plant's computer systems. The sabotage had been carried out remotely, using my access codes and security clearance to make it look like an inside job. Webb had been paid through a series of shell companies that traced back to accounts controlled by Van and Margaret. But the real smoking gun was the timeline. The sabotage had been planned for months, beginning shortly after Van joined Margaret's consulting firm. They'd used her access to my home office to steal my work files, photograph my security badges, and document my daily routines. Every detail of the frame job had been carefully orchestrated to destroy my life and clear the way for their new one together. "There's more," Frank said when I called him from my storage unit hideout. "Van's got a history of this kind of thing. 3 previous business partners who ended up in prison or dead under suspicious circumstances. Guy's a professional at eliminating competition." "What about Margaret? How deep is she in this?" "Up to her eyeballs. The consulting firm is just a front. They've been running government contract scams for years, using Van's military connections to get inside information on bidding processes. Your wife's been laundering money through fake subcontractors and shell companies. So Margaret wasn't just an unfaithful wife. She was a federal criminal who'd decided I was a liability to be eliminated. The woman I'd loved for 17 years had looked at our marriage the same way a mob boss looks at a witness, something to be silenced permanently. "I need one more thing," I told Frank. "I need to know where they're keeping the evidence that proves I'm innocent." "What makes you think they kept evidence?" "Because Van's too smart to trust Margaret completely, and Margaret's too smart to trust Van. People like that always keep insurance policies." Frank was quiet for a moment. "I might know someone who could get into Van's apartment. Take a look around. But it's going to cost." "How much?" "Everything you've got left, plus a favor to be named later." I didn't hesitate. Deal. The break-in happened on Thursday night while Van was at dinner with Margaret, probably celebrating how perfectly their plan had worked. Frank's contact, a professional burglar who went by the name Spider, found exactly what we were looking for: a safe hidden behind a false wall in Van's bedroom closet. Inside the safe were copies of every document related to the frame job, including communications with Marcus Webb, financial records showing payments for the sabotage, and most importantly, video recordings of Margaret and Van discussing their plans in detail. "Insurance policy," Spider explained when he delivered the materials to my storage unit. "Guy like Van, he's always planning for the possibility that his partners might try to screw him over. These recordings are his guarantee that if Margaret ever tries to throw him under the bus, he can drag her down with him." I spent the next 2 days reviewing every document, every recording, every piece of evidence that proved my innocence and their guilt. It was enough to clear my name and put both of them in federal prison for the rest of their lives. But simply turning the evidence over to the FBI felt like letting them off too easy. They destroyed my life, separated me from my son, and tried to frame me for domestic terrorism. Justice through the legal system was too clean, too impersonal for the scope of their betrayal. I wanted them to suffer the way I'd suffered. I wanted them to lose everything the way I'd lost everything, and I wanted them to know that Edwin Granger, the trusting husband, the devoted father, the man they'd thought was too weak to fight back, had been the architect of their destruction. The plan I developed over the next week was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of going to the authorities, I would become the authorities. Instead of trying to prove my innocence, I would prove their guilt in a way that would destroy not just their freedom, but their reputations, their relationships, and their sense of security. I started with Marcus Webb. Frank had tracked him to a cheap motel outside the city, where he was laying low until the heat from the water plant investigation died down. Webb was a small, nervous man in his 40s who looked like he spent too much time in front of computer screens and not enough time in sunlight. Getting into his motel room was easier than I'd expected. The lock was old, the security was non-existent, and Webb had made the mistake of choosing the ground floor for easy escape access. I was waiting in his bathroom when he came back from dinner, sitting in the dark with Frank's untraceable pistol in my lap. Marcus Webb, I said when he turned on the lights. We need to talk. Webb nearly jumped out of his skin, dropping his takeout bag and reaching for what was probably a weapon in his jacket pocket. I wouldn't, I continued, letting him see the gun. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to offer you a deal. Who are you? Edwin Granger, the man you framed for domestic terrorism. Webb's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Van Davis hired you to sabotage the water treatment plant using my access codes. You made it look like an inside job, and I've been sitting in jail for 3 months while you collected your payment. You're crazy. I held up a copy of one of the documents from Van's safe, showing a wire transfer from one of his shell companies to an account in Webb's name. $50,000 paid 2 days after the sabotage. Want to explain what that was for? Webb sat down heavily on his bed, the fight going out of him like air from a punctured tire. Van said you were already guilty of something else. He said this was just evening the score. Van lied. I'm completely innocent, and you helped frame me for crimes I didn't commit. What do you want? I want you to tell the truth. I want you to confess to the FBI exactly what you did and who hired you to do it. I can't do that. Van will kill me. Van's going to prison, and if you don't cooperate with me, you're going to prison too. The difference is, if you help me, I'll make sure the authorities know you were cooperating. That might be worth something when it comes time for sentencing. It took 2 hours of conversation, but eventually, Webb agreed to turn himself in and confess everything. He was facing serious federal charges either way, but cooperation might reduce his sentence from decades to years. There's one more thing, I said as I prepared to leave. I need you to make a phone call to Van Davis. Tell him you're nervous about the investigation, that you think the FBI might be getting close. Ask him to meet you tomorrow night at the old Riverside Mill to discuss your exit strategy. Why? Because Van Davis and I have some unfinished business to discuss. The Riverside Mill had been abandoned for 20 years, a victim of economic changes that had left much of our city's industrial infrastructure to rot. It was the perfect place for a private conversation, isolated, structurally sound enough to be safe, but remote enough that screams wouldn't carry to populated areas. I spent Friday afternoon preparing the mill for Van's visit, setting up lighting, positioning cameras, and arranging the space for maximum psychological impact. By the time I was finished, the main floor looked like a courtroom designed by someone with a very twisted sense of justice. Van arrived exactly on time, driving his red Corvette like he was heading to a business meeting instead of a reckoning. He parked outside the mill and walked in confidently, probably expecting to find Marcus Webb cowering in the shadows. Instead, he found me sitting behind a folding table with a stack of documents, a laptop computer, and enough evidence to destroy his life spread out like exhibits in a trial. "Hello, Van," I said as he stepped into the circle of light I'd arranged. "Thanks for coming." Van stopped dead, his hand moving toward what was probably a concealed weapon. But I'd anticipated that. The laser sight from Frank's rifle was already dancing across his chest, operated by Spider from a concealed position in the mill's upper level. "Edwin Granger, I heard you escaped from custody. The whole city's looking for you." "I'm sure they are, but right now, I'm more interested in talking to you about what you and my wife have been up to." "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. The affair, the frame job, the plan to steal my life and leave me rotting in federal prison. It was a beautiful scheme, Van. Really professional work." Van's eyes moved around the mill, probably looking for escape routes or trying to figure out if I was alone. "You're delusional. Margaret and I are business partners, nothing more." I opened the laptop and played one of the recordings from his safe, a conversation between him and Margaret discussing the details of framing me for the water plant sabotage. Van's voice filled the mill. "Once Edwin's in prison, we'll have a clear path. The house, the kid, the whole suburban dream. Margaret gets to play the loyal wife standing by her terrorist husband, at least until the divorce goes through." Margaret's voice responded, "What about Tommy? He's going to ask questions. Kids adapt. Give him a year, and he'll be calling me Dad. I stopped the recording and looked at Van, who was staring at the laptop like it was a poisonous snake. Recognize those voices? I asked. Van was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating his options and realizing he didn't have any good ones. What do you want? He finally asked. I want you to understand what you took from me. 17 years of marriage, a relationship with my son, my career, my reputation, my freedom. You decided my life was worth less than your convenience. It was just business. No, Van, it was personal. You looked at my life and decided you wanted it. My wife, my house, my family. You thought you could just take it all and leave me with nothing. I stood up from behind the table, keeping my hands visible so Spider wouldn't think I was in danger. But here's what you didn't understand about me, Van. I'm not the weak, trusting husband you thought I was. I'm a man who spent 6 years in Army intelligence, learning how to find people who didn't want to be found and how to destroy enemies who thought they were untouchable. Van's confidence was cracking, replaced by something that might have been fear. The FBI is going to be very interested in these recordings, I continued, gesturing to the evidence spread across the table. They're also going to be interested in Marcus Webb's confession, in the financial records showing how you paid for the sabotage, and in the documents proving that you and Margaret have been running government contract scams for years. You can't prove any of that. I already have. Webb turned himself in this morning and told them everything. The FBI is probably at your apartment right now, and they're definitely on their way to arrest Margaret. Van's face went pale. You're lying. I held up my cell phone, showing a text message from Frank. Package delivered to Agent Chen. Fireworks should start any minute. It's over, Van. Your scheme worked perfectly for 3 months, but it's over now. You're going to prison, Margaret's going to prison, and I'm going home to my son. Van stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He was bigger than me, probably stronger, and definitely more violent. But he was also surrounded by evidence of his crimes and covered by a rifle sight operated by someone who wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. You think you've won? He said finally. I know I have. Even if everything you say is true, even if Margaret and I go to prison, your life is still ruined. Your marriage is over, your reputation is destroyed, and your son will always know that his father was arrested for domestic terrorism. You're right about the marriage, I said. But my reputation will recover when the truth comes out, and Tommy will understand that his father fought back against people who tried to destroy our family. Van laughed, but there was no humor in it. You really think it's going to be that simple? You really think you can just go back to your old life like none of this happened? I think I can build a new life that's better than the old one, a life without lies, without betrayal, and without people who think other human beings are disposable. The sound of sirens in the distance ended our conversation. Agent Chen and her team were probably minutes away, guided by the GPS tracker I'd activated on my phone once Van was safely contained. Looks like our time is up, I said, gathering the evidence from the table. Van made one last desperate play, lunging toward me with surprising speed, but Spider had been watching, and the rifle shot that echoed through the mill sent Van diving for cover behind a concrete pillar. Next one won't be a warning shot, Spider called from the upper level. Van stayed behind his pillar until the FBI tactical team stormed into the mill 5 minutes later, weapons drawn and voices shouting commands. I was on my knees with my hands behind my head when they found me, surrounded by evidence and completely cooperative. Agent Chen looked around the mill, taking in the setup, the documents, and Van cowering behind his concrete shield. Mr. Granger, she said, I think we need to have a very long conversation. 6 hours later, I walked out of the FBI field office as a free man. The charges against me had been dropped, warrants had been issued for Van and Margaret, and the real story of the water plant sabotage was finally coming to light. Margaret was arrested at our house, led away in handcuffs while neighbors and news crews watched. Tommy was staying with my sister until everything got sorted out, but I'd spoken to him on the phone and explained as much as a 16-year-old should have to understand about betrayal, revenge, and justice. Van Davis was charged with conspiracy, domestic terrorism, fraud, and about a dozen other federal crimes that would keep him in prison until he was too old to remember why he'd thought destroying my life was a good idea. Margaret faced similar charges, plus additional counts related to the government contract scams they'd been running. Her consulting firm was shut down, her assets were frozen, and her reputation was destroyed so completely that she'd never work in her field again. I stood outside the FBI building at sunset, breathing free air for the first time in months and thinking about what came next. My marriage was over, my old life was gone, and I'd have to rebuild everything from scratch. But I was alive, I was free, and the people who'd tried to destroy me were facing the consequences of their choices. It wasn't the ending I'd planned when I married Margaret 20 years ago, but it was the ending they'd earned through their greed, their arrogance, and their complete disregard for the lives they'd damaged. Justice had been served, revenge had been achieved, and Edwin Granger was finally going home.